Hejsan, hej och välkomna till vår tillställning här, Bloggseminarium. Mitt namn är Johan Ulvenlöv, jag jobbar för Socialdemokraterna i riksdagen med bloggkontakter. Det här är det tredje bloggseminariet som vi har i vår Nätrot-serie som började 2006. Då samlades 70 internetaktiva mot en högerregering i riksdagen. Och vi har återkommande träffats. Och nu flyttade vi oss till Almedalen. Och vi har bjudit in ytterligare några gäster. Så jag tänker faktiskt bara snabbt lämna över ordet till vår moderator som får presentera vad som kommer ske här under den här timmen. Varsågod Erik.
Tack så mycket Johan, and I'll switch into English right away because as you understand, most of you know, we have two guests from the US who will conduct this seminar in English. And I can tell you all that I'm excited about this. I've been waiting all week to listen to this seminar myself. I'm so happy that you guys are here, and we must say we're a little bit happy with the turnout, right Johan?
Very.
Good. We have some practical information to start with. First of all, this will be recorded on YouTube and put on YouTube later, so you can all watch it again, so you don't have to take notes if you need to use the papers I've handed out as a fan, so you can be safe about that. Secondly, we're gonna end this seminar 2:30 sharp, more or less. So please stay with us. It will be warm, but you can watch it again on YouTube if you fade out a little bit, and we will not keep you for too long. Third, I think we have a great piece of information, and that is after the speech tonight, we will have our two guests at a little social gathering in the restaurant O'Leary's that you all know on Strandgatan, the Irish bar. And we will all be there, and especially the two guests will be there, but I will be there and Johan as well. And if you have questions that we don't have time for, you're welcome to come there. It's a bar right into your right. When you come, you will see us all there. And you're happy to come there, buy your own drink, and hang out with these bloggers and ask the question that we might not have time with.
You said what time?
I said right after the speech. It will be 7:30ish, 7:45 roughly, when the party that I'm not going to mention is ending their speech because it's not a progressive party. You are welcome to come to the bar. And that's a practical information. I will just say one line about this seminar, and Johan and I came up with this a little bit together. And the thing is that last year in Almedalen, you might know that Karl Rowe came here in order to tell us all how to handle bloggers. We do it the other way around. We bring bloggers here to tell us how to handle Karl Rowe. A little bit of JFK, if you ask me. Yeah, it was, And now we will switch into this event right away. And we have Jane Hamsher from Firedoglake, and we've been hanging out a little bit. Fantastic blogger. You saw the Clash live 3 times, which impressed a lot, but we will talk politics and blogs mostly now, I think. And, of course, also John Aravosis. Your blog is called Americablog, and we have also been hanging out a little bit. You have an interesting background as a lawyer and as an activist in many ways. So we decided to do it like this. Since you don't maybe know everything about these guys, like Jane co-produced the film Natural Born Killers, written by a certain Quentin Tarantino and directed by Oliver Stone. These are really interesting people, as you hear. So we will start by giving each of you a minute or two just to make a personal introduction. And what I would like to know is not your favorite dog, because you like dogs, but more about your background as a blogger. How did you start blogging? And maybe an example of why you think blogs matters. And we'll start with you, and I'll do the same with John. And, we start with a round of applause, too. They've been flying a long way together.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for bringing us here and having us. It's been absolutely wonderful, and you guys have done an amazing job. Just before we get started, because, we come from another country, and sometimes it helps to know kind of who we're talking to. How many people here have blogged or have a blog? All right, this is good. How many people here are professional journalists or have journalistic training? All right. And how many people are work for the party? All right, so this is good. This is good. It sort of gives us an idea because you never quite know how to pitch it to someone. I started blogging in 2004, right after the election. I think shortly after John did. I had, as he said, worked in Hollywood, and it's not completely separate from punk rock, actually. I got into punk rock in the 70s, and there was this amazing energy around it. And I got into film in the 80s, the indie film movement, and there was an amazing energy around that, too. And you could feel that about the internet and politics in 2004. For a lot of reasons they'll go into later, it really was attracting just an amazing quality of people who were there starting to explore this new medium and debate. I personally decided to start blogging because I was sort of a student of politics even when I wasn't involved. And in the 80s, Ralph Reed and Karl Rove, who maybe you know, maybe you don't, at the Young Republicans, that whole movement, when they decided to come in and really take over the Republican Party, made a big move to organize the churches. And they took existing structures that people could meet at, and they collected them together and communicated with them in a way that organized a group of people through the churches to act together and have influence disproportionate to their numbers. And I was always looking for something on the left that could do the same thing in the United States, and there just wasn't anything. And so when the blogs came around, it seemed like this could connect the person in Maine who was upset about something that the person in Phoenix was upset about. Because we have such a huge geographical space to deal with, it was always difficult to connect people and sort of achieve critical mass. So I just, as an experiment in 2004, decided to start blogging to see what could happen. And I put up blogs on Daily Kos, which is a big diary blog, just to see if I could get on the recommended list. It was like a challenge. But then after they would sort of fall off the list, I would go, well, what do I do with them? Well, I'll put them over on my blog, because you can have a free blog. Well, what do you call a blog? I don't know. They wanted a name for it. I figured my family would show up and see it. So my loan-out company in Hollywood was called Firedoglake, just because I like to lie by the fire with my dogs and watch the Los Angeles Lakers. And so I put it in, not realizing that 5 years later I would have to live with the stupid name. But so I started blogging 2004. It was sort of just as things were taking off, and I was kind of the last person in under the wire. In terms of the big blogs before or Glenn Greenwald, I guess, came shortly after me. But that's sort of my history, and it's been a lot of fun. But John's my senior by about 6 months, so he has much more to tell.
Yeah, but perfect.
In blog years.
Perfect. Personal introduction, and you do the same, John.
Okay. My background is more traditional politics, which is interesting because I think a lot of the top political bloggers did not necessarily have backgrounds in politics before. I did. What was interesting, though, is the top bloggers in the States, on the left, but also on the right, really, all tended to have a professional background, meaning Jane was a already senior person in Hollywood. I'd worked in the U.S. Senate, World Bank. I'd written for The Economist, real jobs. Another friend of ours, Duncan Black, who writes one of the top blogs, is a PhD in economics and teaches at a university. Marcos is a lawyer and a former military man. So there really isn't anybody among the top blogs who's somebody who sort of dropped out of high school, didn't know what to do with their life, decided they'd blog, what the hell. Because at least in the States, you kind of have this bias of people thinking bloggers are work in their pajamas, in their sleeping clothes, and I mean, to some degree we do, but the assumption is that you own no other clothes. So I think that's something that's just sort of interesting. With me, I started my blog about 5 years ago, pretty much just because I'd gotten fed up with the Bush administration. I have in the past, and have been since for about 10 years now, done a lot of gay rights advocacy online, and I had been wanting for a while to see if I could duplicate the kind of campaigns I'd done on gay issues, where not blogs, but I'd use the internet to basically blow an issue up in the news nationally, and wanted to see if I could do the same thing with national politics that weren't gay politics. At the same time, President Bush I got to this point with Bush in 2004 and decided maybe it was a good opportunity to use the blog to sort of vent a little bit my feelings about Bush, but also see if I could maybe impact the national debate. So I'll stop there. But
yeah,
sort of
we should also mention you started in '97 already as a political consultant.
Yeah, I started consulting in 1997.
Yeah.
Political internet combined, and that's when I started doing some of these large advocacy campaigns on gay rights. as well.
Exactly. And now, we have the personal introduction, and we will go on, starting with you, Jane, talking a little bit how the blogs have changed the media landscape in the U.S. And you will use the board a little bit also, I think. And we've been planning this now. I think it will be really... We did this on a napkin yesterday night, and I said, we got to do it because it illustrates a lot how the media landscape has changed in the U.S.
This is something that I normally do on the back of a napkin, and I've been saying I have to work this up into a presentation one day, but never have. So this is the first run. Let's see. So you'll forgive me if I'm a little... Many of you will remember that in the United States in the 90s, we impeached our president. And that happened under very unique circumstances. Because at the time, Bill Clinton still had, 68% approval rating in the American public? And they had been trying him in the media for years over something that he hadn't done. And it culminated in this sort of gridlock of American politics. And people who look at that go, how did that happen? Like, how could that possibly happen? For years, the major newspapers, in a very Pravda-like fashion, were writing stuff about him that absolutely, whitewater, just wasn't true. And it's not just me as a progressive who thinks that. Empirically, if you've seen The Hunting of the President or anything else, the stuff just wasn't true. So how did it get out there, and how did it have such an influence on our politics? So we'll go back to, 1994. And we'll call this the sort of media landscape, the sort of media message. Does the media message have an influence on what popular opinion is? Well, they've done studies, and they tend to figure that what is important in the media is important to the public. The public may not necessarily agree with what the media says about something, but their ability to prioritize something is quite parallel to what the media does. So you've got journalists here, right? And they're sort of the conduits to information coming out. So we've got the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are probably the two most influential papers in the country. And, there's a variety of others. And they have journalists. And journalists in 1994 are lazy. So there are a bunch of Arkansas political operatives who decide that since Arkansas is so far from the Washington, and nobody really wants to go there, that they can just start making this stuff up. And they actually set up an office in Washington and started printing up sheets and delivering them to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalism and saying, this is what's going on. So they were able to interact with the journalists directly and feed this stuff to them. And people like me are sitting in California reading it on the front page of the Washington Post and going, this makes no sense. I don't understand what's happening here. But because I can't connect with somebody in Phoenix or somebody in Maine or somebody in Florida who thinks the same thing and fact check this, by going and looking at my own documents, I don't know what to think about this. So a few people, well-funded, controlled the information into the gateways, into the sort of general consciousness. It wasn't until 1996 when an article in Harper's Magazine came out and resulted in this book called Fools for Scandal, written by Gene Lyons, who is from Arkansas, knew Arkansas politics, and knew what was happening, that he kind of blew the lid off of this. But by that time, the media landscape was so saturated with this, and the Republicans were in full thrall. And, impeachment this, and the media was just completely snooping in the Clintons' underwear drawer. And then Monica Lewinsky, as many of you know, happened. But as a result of Whitewater, that wasn't the precipitating event. This was something that got turned up as the result of this investigation. So a few people were able to capture a few very prominent journalists, feed information to them, and turn the whole American political system on its head. Progressives were over here. You've got labor. You've got think tanks like CAP. You've got, liberal journals like The Nation. And they're all screaming, what the heck? What's going on here? And they can't get in here because these people don't want to pay attention to them. So nothing of that is getting through. It's every time you turn on your television, it's all being dominated by, as John can say, Chris Matthews, talking about Hillary Clinton's underwear drawer. All right, so we fast forward to 2000. In 2000, Pew did a study And they found that 5% of Americans got their news online, starting to. It wasn't very much. But because of the situation with revenues, namely $1 to a dime, for every print dollar that advertisers like the New York Times and the Washington Post had for their print version for readers, for every time they lost that dollar of revenue for readers by their readers going online, they got 10% of that money. So they went, 5%, I want nothing to do with this. We're just going to take our model, which is we speak, you listen, and we're going to put that online. And you guys can read it if you want, and if you don't, we're still the newspaper of record, and what we decide is what is the news. So this leaves this whole space in the middle free for bloggers. Because those guys didn't want to do anything. We were willing to go online and say, hey, we'll talk with people who want to show up in our comments section. We'll actually look at these articles that are coming out, and we can now reference them with articles that this same person did in the past. And the problem is that this person is writing these articles, and they've written A, B, and C article, and none of these 3 articles agree on the same set of facts. They contradict each other. So we're able to look at those 3 articles, and we're able to say, you know what? A, B, and C don't make any sense, and this writer is full of shit.
Or we even had, remember the Washington Post that drives us a little crazy, the big paper in Washington, the editorial in the paper would contradict the news in the paper on the same day.
On the same day.
It has happened here as well.
Yeah. So we were able to say.
Exposed it. Yeah.
And they would get upset. They'd get really angry. They would shut down their comments section. They'd call us, beasts, whatever. And their model is, if they do something wrong, if they print something that's inaccurate, New York Times has 13 years of backlog corrections that they haven't printed now online. Their model was, we can ignore this. Unless we print a letter to the editor, no one will ever know. Well, that didn't exist anymore because they didn't control the flow of information. Because what we started to see was that at that same time, there isn't a terribly strict correlation between what gets printed in the media and what gets printed in the blogs, but there's a very good correlation between cable news and what happens with the blogs. So stories that the blogs would pick up in the morning would rise to cable news at night, and cable news is the way that most Americans get their news. So we were able to go after these people not only online when they would see us linking to them and get people showing up and being very upset with them, but it would wind up in cable news. So they didn't control the flow of information anymore. We were fact-checking them. And what we were able to do was get the progressive message into the mainstream media. We were able, suddenly these people who were powerless before to get anybody to care about their stuff could fire through the blogs into the mainstream media. Now, what happened in this situation is we've got all this space. New York Times and Washington Post don't want to get in here. It's 2000. There's 5% of the people getting their online news. I was going to look these figures up, but I left my power cord at home. 2001, say there was 7%. In 2009, there are now 50% of people in America get their news online. And the Washington Post and the New York Times ceded so much space. It's pretty fixed right now. I would say, and as you would probably agree, the number of big blogs in the United States, probably the top 10 probably get 90% of the traffic. So the way that we function is that, well, let me back up for 1 second. The reason that we had such an explosive growth, and we probably get 100,000 people a day turning up on our blogs during a good weekday. Up to 200, 250,000 if a real issue is the news. The reason that our growth was fueled was because, as John says, of George Bush, hatred of George Bush and the Iraq War. People don't remember, but even when the Iraq War began, only 47% of the country disapproved of it. So by the time the blogs started growing into a real force, 2004 or so, oh, I'm going to need that space for something else. Around 2004, people who were dissatisfied with the war started flowing into the blogs, and it fueled our traffic. It got people into the habit of showing up there for the news. And what we really did was we created our own counter-narrative. It really was the most powerful thing that we did.
Do you have a practical example, or John, does either of you have a practical example that, where the blogs now have influenced the media so much in their way of writing, so they had to change or back down?
I mean, I can give you the Scooter Libby trial was something that I was involved in, which is very directly parallel to Whitewater in many ways, because they started to use the same system here to influence journalists. If you've all heard of Judy Miller, the White House was leaking the national intelligence estimate and things like that to her, and it was winding up on the front page of the New York Times. Only this time it didn't work. Because bloggers were there and we were saying, no, this is wrong. This isn't what happened. Judy Miller wound up being fired from the New York Times. And during the trial of Scooter Libby, we followed it very closely. We were actually at the trial. We live blogged it. And all the journalists, we wound up on the front page of the New York Times because all the journalists followed it through what we were doing. But because we had constructed this counter-narrative over the years of covering it, no, I know the administration says this thing, but we say this thing. We were able to heavily influence what the public perception was of that. And so rather than buying the whole Scooter Libby is a martyr, poorly unjust guy, by the time he was actually put in jail, the country very much supported that verdict. So I would offer that up as a simple example.
It's a good example. The bloggers went there and they were live blogging from the trial, and at the end of the day, the journalists, they ended up reading the blogs in order to cover the trial a little bit.
Sure, that actually gets into one more point, which I will make, and then I'll let this go until later. But one of the things that we do is that we drive traffic to experts. So let's say it's a Supreme Court issue. There's a guy over there, Marty Lederman, who used to cover the Supreme Court. And every time something would happen with the Supreme Court, the big blogs would say, oh, let's go look and see what Marty is doing.
And Marty's a blog expert, you mean? I mean, an expert on the court who's a blogger.
Well, not anymore. The Obama White House now has him in the Office of Legal Counsel. Okay. But he was the guy who would always say, oh, bloggers in their pajamas. Well, no. But so there's, somebody writes about the Supreme Court. There's another blogosphere over here about finance. And these people write about finance day in and day out. It doesn't matter whether finance is in the news, they're going to cover what's in that day. When finance comes into the news, and that's what cycles in, we cycle traffic out to them so that they're the ones that become the experts and sort of have the say over what people are talking about and what they think. So, it's sort of an ecosystem that depends on having, many, if it was Swedish issues, we would link to you and drive the traffic out here, assuming our readers could speak Swedish. But that's sort of a simple model of kind of how we function right now.
And I think that a lot of you are now thinking what I thought yesterday, that you also see the labor box and the think tank and the progressive media trying to influence the media landscape, and how this in some ways could also transfer to a Swedish context in terms of how you can use progressive organizations through bloggers and the internet to influence the traditional old media. But we'll stop there for now, and we'll turn to you again, John. And now I want to know more in the same way. We're turning now from the media to the political system, because you've been in the political system. How would you say that the blogs have changed party politics in the last years? And some things I want to know about is, for example, the intranet, My Barack Obama that we talked of. Was that really using the internet as its fullest potential? Blog outreach, the thing that Johan is doing. As you know, we're doing it together, this seminar, Aktualitetspolitiken and Johan. And we wondered also, how do you work with people like Johan, for example, that's trying to help bloggers in the political system? Also, we talked about, do politicians understand?
Are there people like Johan in the political system in America who try to help bloggers?
And bringing you here for a nice summer?
No, here there are. In the States, I'm not sure.
And also, what is your impression you can mention a little bit also about the Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama campaign and how bloggers influence that.
Okay, that would be 5 questions. You're not allowed to do that.
But you answer them in one answer really quick.
Let me talk a little bit about Obama, because, I think that's what interests a lot of people here from what we've already seen, even informally. It's been very interesting, the relationship, if you can call it that, between the Obama campaign and the Obama White House and the bloggers. Obama was certainly very adept at using the internet for his campaign and very good at using it at the White House. But what I have often argued on my blog is the Obama campaign or the Obama team is very interested in what I call political autarky. Autarky is a term in economics which basically means one country decides it's going to do everything and it doesn't need to trade with anyone. And you would often see this in developing countries. They want a tech industry, and they want an oil industry, and they want every industry the country's going to do itself because that's what good dictators do. And what you often see, what we saw with the Obama campaign is they built up a web presence called mybarackobama.com or my.barackobama.com, whatever it was. And they built up their own, or they tried to build up their own blogs within this system. They were not very interested in working with the traditional blogs outside. They wanted to create their own. With the nonprofit, the NGO groups in Washington, who are the advocacy groups. They are the lobbyists, or many of them are lobbyists. On the left, not as much interest in working with them either, to the point that the Obama campaign even tried to stop many of these groups from getting funding. We found a number of our friends worked for an organization that was set up explicitly to help Democrats in the election last year, and the Obama campaign shut that group down. They couldn't do it directly for legal reasons, but indirectly they told donors, don't give to this Democratic group or you're never going to visit the White House ever again.
I don't know that was so indirect. I think Steve Hildebrand was calling people.
Maybe more direct then. But what was interesting is then in the last 6 weeks of the campaign, when they got worried, they then let everybody know, oh, you know what, we were wrong. There's 6 weeks to go. Please create these organizations. What we found since then is, and again, it's a much longer story I won't get into yet, but the Obama people, they don't like blogs. They don't like outsiders in general, outside interest groups, I think, or outside power centers, but they really are not. They don't like the blogs. We've worked with them when they're desperate, but then when things are going well, they aren't interested in working with us, and it's been a very strange relationship, I think. Certainly for my blog, because we were considered one of the blogs that was closer with them. On the left, because we endorsed them about a year before the election. But it's been very up or down. I'll stop there just because I don't want to keep going.
But I think this is one of the things I wanted to hear from you, because the image in Sweden is often that Barack Obama was so great at aiding the blogs and really using the blogs in his campaign.
Not the blogs, right? The internet, yes.
The internet, yes,
yeah.
but the blogs, no. And the thing is that he built his own intranet, like a few Swedish parties has tried to do as well. So that's an interesting comparison, I think. But another thing I was thinking about also is, as we said, the outreach. How has that changed now? Do you think that people in Congress also are as interested in doing the work that Johan is doing, trying to get people into blogs into the political process or not?
Do you want to talk about the example we talked about on the way here of the Congresswoman or not?
Which Congresswoman?
The one that doesn't respond anymore.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's interesting because of what we did for her.
We raised, it gets into, again, another larger story, but there's a congressperson that we raised, I believe, $64,000 in the last election cycle, and more beforehand.
And she was not in office.
She was the underdog.
Was
she was trying to challenge a Democratic. One of the things that you sort of have to understand about the blogs is that when we came of age, we didn't come of age as part of the Democratic Party. We were our own independent political force, as opposed to the Republicans, who were very much echoing what the Republican Party was saying. And so one of the things that we did was we challenged Joe Lieberman, a senator, who was, very much warmongering and, lobbying for
a Democrat.
Conservative.
Right-wing Democrat.
Right, a right-wing Democrat. And we challenged him in a primary and beat him. And instead of going away, he ran as an independent and with the support of the Democratic Party and the Democratic establishment and won his seat back. And we were very angry about that. So, there's always been a tension between the blogs and the party establishment. We helped someone challenge a Democratic establishment candidate who was already in office, Alwyn. Her name was Donna Edwards. We raised a lot of money for her online. I think $64,000 in the last election. more in
and
2006.
I think it's fair to say that the blogs were really the first to get interested in her as a candidate. She was nobody, and by the blogs starting to raise her some real money, then you had some of the other more with the unions and others, right, who
came in at the end
because we helped make her real as a candidate.
Well, we kept her alive when she didn't have any money early in the. There were months that we know that her campaign would have collapsed,
and she's a
and she
congresswoman.
won.
Yeah.
And so now I've been contacting her for a week over something, emailing every day, and we can't even get a response. But that's not an anomaly. That's sort of the rule. They get in and then they're sort of embarrassed about us and they don't need us anymore. So this is what we fight, and it's a systemic problem.
Well, and even one very interesting thing with Congress is Harry Reid, who's the Democratic majority leader of the U.S. Senate, and Nancy Pelosi, who's the Speaker of the House, Democrat of the U.S. House. We had very good relations with both of their offices. And, we'd fight on different issues that we didn't think they were doing enough, but we had very good relations. They even each had a blogger outreach person. And for the last several years, Nancy Pelosi the Democrats won back.
Who is Nancy Pelosi?
I said the Speaker of the House,
Yeah,
the lead Democrat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Yeah. The week that the Democrats won back the Congress, so this is 2 years ago now? I'm already forgetting. She won on a Tuesday, which is huge. Thursday, Wednesday or Thursday? No, it was the afternoon. I believe it was the afternoon. They organized a call for bloggers with Nancy Pelosi the very day she won, and we're thinking, my God, she must have better things to do. She just became the most powerful woman in the country to then just to do a conference call with bloggers, but she did. And last year, her key staffer doing bloggers went to the campaign, I guess, and Harry Reid, the Senate Democrat leader, his lead blog contact went to work for an outside organization. Since that time, we've had no contact pretty much with their offices at all.
Oh, I actually... That's different for me.
Oh, we haven't. It's totally gone.
Oh, so I talk to Pelosi's office a lot.
Well, we deal with Katrina. How about Reid?
Oh, no.
Yeah, Senate. But even then it's interesting because it depends on the blog. But it went from this to this. I think it's hot and cold. I think it's what we found is when they need you, they want you. But also there's a level of fear I think that's always there about the blogs. And I've heard this from senators who said to us, "You criticize us." Yeah. Well, I can't work with you. You criticize us. And I said, you mean there aren't advocacy organizations who criticize you, and you don't find things in common? But it's a very strange relationship when it exists.
Yeah. And I think. Good. What we wanted to show now is two things to start with, just to summarize a little bit before we move on. I know it's hot. The first thing was how it changed the media landscape a little bit, and I think you all got that pretty good from the graph and stuff. And I also think there were a few highlights in this political discussion, because the media image in Sweden is that Obama loved the blogs, he did everything right, and the blogs are so happy about Obama right now, and all the Democrats really understand how to use the blogs. And what we can hear now is that it's certainly a different story. Some people do understand, and we were talking yesterday about some people in the Congress that understands a lot how to work with the internet and with bloggers still. Others are really happy to get the support for a while, but when real life kicks in and they get the majority, they start working as they always have. And I think that's really interesting to bear with us, because for the future also in Sweden, because hopefully in 2010 we will get a red and green majority here, and we will see how people that helped the red-green majority into office, how they will work with senior politicians after that.
And let me make one point, because I think what's interesting is not just that Democrats, and certainly the White House now, I think in many ways has decided that blogs are not helpful or useful, or they kind of don't want to talk to us. What they found at the same time is, and Jane's found this an issue she's working on now, for example, on healthcare reform, which is a big issue in the States. I found it again on the gay rights issues that I care about. When they ignore us, we then refuse to be ignored. And when they do something wrong, we write about it, we talk about it, and we get people activated. And we've both been very successful at causing major problems for the Democrats and the White House, even though they've ignored us. And what my point is, our source of power doesn't come from our relationship with the Congress or relationship with the White House, and they kind of think it does. And they think that, well, no longer, we won't talk to John anymore, so he won't be able to cause us any problems. And
doesn't work that way.
And it doesn't work. I mean, we had a major blow up on gay rights in the last 2 weeks in the States that I and a couple other bloggers did, but I orchestrated it basically. And within 5 days of launching this campaign against Obama, he had to have a public meeting in the White House with a number of gay groups to try to make, and on TV, to try to make the country feel better that he didn't hate gay people. And again, you'd have to do your own research on it to believe me, but we caused major problems, and they still don't get that that this is a group that has power that you should at least talk to, because we agree with them more than we disagree, at least until now.
So the media landscape has changed. Secondly, we have the political situation that also has changed, but it's complicated, as you say sometimes these days. It's both sides of the coin you can see. Thirdly, we're moving on, before we open up for questions and so on, also into how rules and decision makings are made in the US. A little bit, how is a law passed and how can bloggers influence the technical legislation process in the US. Do you want to start with that, Jane?
Well, this is the second part of the cocktail napkin, and I actually think that John probably needs to talk a little bit more
because I'm going to bring him
about
in
what
because he's
happened
a lawyer on the Hill.
with
yeah?
Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and what's happened in the past couple of weeks, because this is sort of the meta of how this stuff works. But
then give your meta, and then I'll give a concrete example.
Yeah,
perfect.
well,
that's perfect.
Yeah, the situation is that.
Excuse me.
Do you want to wipe that one out, or want to keep it?
Yeah, I can wipe this one out.
Yeah,
How about
you have the little. You have it here.
Huh? Oh, great. Thank you. So, we'll leave that part up there. It took us a long time to learn this. So, this is a good tip. If you can leave here with anything, this is it. When Bush was in office, nothing was possible because he could veto anything, and he was George Bush. Now, at least the Democrats, now that they have all three offices, have all branches of, the Congress and the executive, have to pretend like they care what liberals think. So,
liberals meaning people on the left, of course.
Oh, sorry, yes,
yeah.
I forgot. It doesn't show. Okay,
yeah.
We'll try this one. So at the beginning, somebody blows the whistle for whatever reason, right? They say, we're going to pass health care, or we're going to pass energy reform, or, we have a problem that we have to deal with. And critical mass has been achieved such that somebody thinks they need to do something, or there's so much money to be made that the people who are making it are creating like a drilling in the Alaskan National Wildlife Reserve, which was, just a blown up issue again. This is a simple example, but we'll call this the day that they vote. This is the day the decision is made. Here's where the whistle gets blown. Now, lobbyists are already in there all day long on their issue, influencing members of Congress. So when they have things like hearings, when they're doing their research as to what they should be including in a bill, when they do their markups, these people know what's happening such that they get in there and they're constantly shaping the conversation so that the decision that gets reached is the one that they want to reach. Blogs typically get in here and have people calling their offices right here. What's wrong with that picture? Decision's already been made. You can't change people's minds at that point. The media picks it up after the bill's been passed, and they start covering. Right. But nothing's going to happen here because it's already a law. There's not really anything that you can do. So the time that you have to get in and start shaping the conversation is back here because things are very fluid. And one phone call here is worth more than 100,000 phone calls here. When you can get one of the things that there was bad banking law passed recently. So just goes to show you, your team gets in power. The same things are going to still be in play. And if you're going to have to decide whether you're a party person or you're a principle person. And John and I both sort of came down on the principles.
Well, and I'll say really quick, one of my sort of probably my biggest political mentor is a friend of mine who used to work for Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, back in the 90s. And one of the things he had told me at the time was, because I watched him work and said, you're always spending so much time trying to work Democrats and trying to beat up these organizations that are on the left. I thought they were with us. And he told me, oh, you'll see, you will spend so much more time beating up your friends than beating up your enemies. And it's something we found true. And it's not by choice. It's because, as Jane said, once you're in, they always promise you when we get in power, we're going to change everything. And they get in power and then they become very afraid.
There's a whole set of
In our country,
influences,
yeah.
surrounding Congress people that cause them to be susceptible to what these people think that I won't even get into here. But the point is that we tend to be, to the extent that blogs are responsive to what's going on in the media and don't have their own source of information about what's going on back here, it becomes very difficult to influence the decision-making process. Because if you're getting all your information from the media and the media doesn't care about it until down here, you've lost your ability to be able to use an Aikido move and with a little bit of influence be able to shift things. If you can get in down here when things are fluid and be very aggressive and be in there every day, it depends on inside information, developing contacts who are involved in the decision-making process, who care about the issue too, because a lot of people do. They don't want to pass crappy bills. And if they see that you are willing to be a person of integrity who will fight for a particular cause, they'll give you information. And if you can get in back here and give that information to your readers and let your readers know 10, 15 people can make a difference back here where 100,000 people up here can't. So,
yeah.
Perfect. And let me add one point that I think is interesting, is almost a precursor to what Jane just said. I don't know about Sweden because I'm not an expert even. I'm not a novice about Swedish politics even.
I think we talked a lot about it.
We did, but you know what I learned about coming to Sweden is all of your names that we thought we knew in the States are totally different than how we pronounce them. I've been calling him Johan all week, and I finally heard his friend say Johan, and I went, no, Johan. Is that it? And I went, what the hell's that? So I really don't know Sweden, but I do know France. I have a decent knowledge of Greece and some other European countries in terms of politics. And one thing that's very interesting with the States is as citizens, we are able to influence our government. And it's something that at least in other countries I've gone to, it's been sort of different when I explain the kind of advocacy I do or the things Jane is doing. I was in Russia like 15 years ago in the Far East, in Petropavlovsk, in Kamchatka, and talking to a local government official and telling him kind of how it works. I was working in the U.S. Senate for a senator at the time, and telling him how, half my job was taking letters from constituents, letters from voters, who would write and say, Senator, I'm having a problem with this government agency and my airplane. Because I was with the state of Alaska where a lot of people have small planes. Probably Sweden too, I would guess. And the government regulations are blah, 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 I don't know. Could you please write to the agency and help me? And we'd write to the agency, and it would put a little pressure on the government, and they'd write back to our constituent and say, oh, we're so sorry, okay, we're investigating, blah, blah. And I was telling this with a Russian, and he said, and they pay you, right? I said, oh, no, I get paid for my job. No, I mean the constituent, they pay you. It's like, no, they don't pay me, but you have a car. I don't like car. I don't mean to compare you guys to the Russians, but please. Yeah. But what was interesting is I get a lesser version of that when I go to other countries. In France, I've talked about the advocacy I've done where, again, you get pissed off at the president, you write about it, you call your friends, you call some journalists, you plan an event that you think would be interesting to the media, and all of a sudden you get coverage in the Washington Post. And, the president or a politician starts to get a little nervous, and you can tell because things happen. And telling a French friend of mine, it says, we just don't do things like that. A private citizen wouldn't really think, oh, I can go influence the White House or I can go influence a member of Congress. And in the States, you can, especially members of Congress, as Jane said. If you're from a smaller state, the smallest states are probably 500,000 people. If they get 25 people calling their office complaining about an issue, and real phone calls. In other words, not reading a script, but actually 25 different calls about the same thing that are clearly from the heart. They get scared. I'll end with this point. My boss, who was a U.S. senator at the time, once came to the office, and I remember he yelled at me because, of course, I was in the airport back home, and somebody came up to me and they yelled at me, Senator, why did you do blah, 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 I don't know what? And it was my issue. And why did he yell at me? It's like, I don't know why he yelled at you. But because one constituent came to him in an airport and said, that was enough to make the senator pay attention and start to say, well, find out what's going on. Now, that won't happen in California, partially because the senator we have from there is an idiot, but also it's a state of 50 million, or I don't even know how many millions of people. So one person or even 20 people might not matter. But in a smaller state, it does. But I just wanted to say that because I don't know how your politics is, but for a lot of Europeans, the kind of things we talk about, they kind of go, we just wouldn't do, or in France, forget it. That they just sort of say, yeah, the phone company sucks, they cheat us, and what do you do? In the States, Jane and I would go online we would go online and write about the phone company, and all of a sudden, somebody from the phone company calls you and says, why didn't you call me first? So it might be a different system, I don't know.
No, in many ways, of course, it's the decision-making process is always like doing sausage in every country. You don't really want to know what's going on until you have the final product. But the reason we wanted to show this also is, of course, that it's a lot of similarities with Sweden. If you look at the FRA debate, for example, a lot of things are happening. You have a vote, and then the media starts covering it, and everybody's what's really going on, and you have to do it all over again. So this was, again, one way of showing how you can work with blogs and the internet in order to, again, like the progressive movement did 100 years ago, used to get people together, try to influence in your local constituency, and also on the national level, even on the global level today, because the possibilities we have as progressives today communicating with each other is so much bigger than you had 100 years ago, thanks to the blogs in the middle and the development of the internet. Good. Before we have one more issue that I wanted to talk about, and as you have understood, this seminar is also about trying to, in an indirect way, transfer some examples to the Swedish context. And we need to say a little bit about money also. How are you guys funded? How do you really manage to have all these blogs and this wonderful development that I think many in this room feel a little bit inspired by, and you want to bring these experiences to the Swedish context? But for example, Jane, you have one example now of a political action committee, Act Blue, that you've been setting up.
Well, Act Blue was actually not... we have Blue America. Act Blue is democratic funders, I will call them that. George Soros and other people got together a few years ago and decided that they were going to fund some good pieces of progressive infrastructure, and one of the best was Act Blue.
It's actblue.com.
And Act Blue is a place where anybody who's running for Democratic office can have a page where you can give donations to them. Now that sounds simple, but the thing, and I don't know how it is here, but when you get donations in the United States, there's all sorts of SEC reporting that has to be done, and it's very expensive to do
laws and regulations,
all that stuff.
Yeah.
So they figured out a way to automate all of it, and it was a godsend to Democratic candidates.
It's like a PayPal. It's like PayPal for political candidates.
Yeah,
but
and the right has
PayPal
never been able to duplicate it, and we have raised
$90 million.
$90 million.
We
now.
meaning the blogs, the Netroots in general. $90 million for Democratic candidates since 2004.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've raised, Blue America's raised $2 million, I think. And we also had a political action committee, a separate political action committee called Accountability Now, that raised about $500,000 over the same stuff that the Pirate Party is talking about, the privacy and FISA, we call it, things.
Wait, I want to. She's not explaining this well because I told her before we came that we may have to explain what each other did because I think you're better at bragging about someone else.
Like, let's stop talking about this because what John did in the past 2 weeks is actually really interesting, and it's going to be the most interesting thing we talk about.
But real quick, because this is an interesting point, is because I think it's illustrative. We had a big debate, we still are in our country, over this electronic eavesdropping or domestic spying, if you want to call it. I would call it that, where the Bush administration didn't go to court like they were supposed to get a legal order to spy on Americans.
Yes.
They didn't. And Obama said he was going to oppose it. A lot of people said they were going to vote against this horrible law. They didn't. And I'm shortening this, but basically, Jane decided on her blog with her community that they'd had enough. She formed a political action committee, which basically is a legal entity that allows you to collect money and work and lobby. And it's kind of hard to explain, but it's a legal entity for collecting money in politics, basically. She just formed this herself, decided to take donations from the internet because, again, she was pissed off about this domestic spying, and they raised $500,000 from the reader of just her blogs.
Basically,
that's- yeah.
Congress was depending that we would do this every time and not start calling till there. So they'd go through all this kabuki about how they were going to, repeal this or how they were going to end the war and everything else, and then they'd make a big show, and then of course they wouldn't. They never intended to, knowing that we wouldn't start calling till after everything was already set in concrete. So we said, okay, we're going to raise this money and we're going to stop doing this. We know what's happening now, and we're going to fight bad Democrats who, keep promising one thing and delivering another. So that's sort of how that's set up. But
And I think one thing that is very difficult to transfer to the Swedish context is the way in which you have financed the development of the blogosphere, because you have a tradition now. You put this little thing on your blog and you can donate money, and people actually do it to a large extent, and you can also take it further, as you have done with political action committees, and donate money from Soros could donate money, and a lot of individuals can donate money.
He never has, but
we're
more financed. Our size, the size of the big blog, I mean, it's very different when you're talking about big blogs and small blogs. The size of the big blogs has allowed us to be largely financed by advertising. Not well, but financed by advertising. And the way that we sort of have developed our infrastructure, we're able to run on a lot less costs than the New York Times, that has a big building and has to send people everywhere to cover things. And that has to do a lot with the changing nature of journalism, but I don't know how much of that is applicable here.
And it's really, I mean, I don't know how many of us, but I think it's always been a small number who have been able to make enough money from their blogs to work exclusively. 100% of your job is the blog. I know for me, it took I started in 2004. It took about a year for the money to be, from advertising, to be real. Not good, but real, meaning it's not $20. It's $100 a month, and you go, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. It took until 2 years ago, maybe more or less, for me to make enough money that I could work on the blog full time and not try to find outside work. Yeah. Last year was my best year. I was able to get enough for myself to give a good amount of money to two guys writing for me, but not full time. But a nice stipend. Maybe, I don't even know, $20,000 for one of them for the year, which was nice. I mean, in America, that's not a lot of money. It's good. But then this year with the economy, the advertising's gone down again. So now I'm doing consulting work again. So I mean, it's not bad money when you get a lot of traffic, but it's never been enough. Unless you are the #1 blog. I mean, Marcos Daily Kos, which is our largest left blog, but also our biggest, thank God, political blog in the States. Marcos gets so much traffic, as it does Huffington Post. I should say he and Huffington Post are tied in a sense. They get so much traffic, so many visitors, that they're able to sell so many ads in, even though they're maybe small ads, that they're able to get enough money to start doing interesting things, to maybe pay more staff full-time, things like that. But even in our country, it's still a small number, I think, who are really able to do more than really paying for a few people, I think, really.
This whole presentation was actually being developed as a presentation to these groups over here, because they sort of assume that we'll always exist and they can send us their press releases and that we will deliver their message. Yeah. And what we're trying to say is that if you want us to grow and be able to compete, now that the Washington Post and the New York Times have realized that this is the only game in town, if you want us to still be here, you have to start supporting us, whether we say the thing you want us to or not, because our very existence is very critical to. It's a longer story, but even Barack Obama getting elected, and the way that conversation was reshaped and the way his campaign entered it would, I don't think, have been possible had we not been sort of developing the anti-war message that he ran on. Didn't work out so well now with Afghanistan, but that's that. But these people, if you're going to start, I would say start now, letting these people know that you have value to them and their ability to be able to influence the conversation. Remember, you'll all go back to 1998 is what I tell them.
And of course, we are in the facilities of the Swedish Labor Union, for example.
Actually,
so we'll start there, maybe.
Well, I'm going to keep jumping in, because we had talked about so many possible things to talk about that you guys would find interesting, because, at least as an American, I find conferences so boring. And the panel discussions are usually...
Keep your energy. I think you're really helping
but the panel discussions are usually, and now I will read you a speech. Again, it's like the Soviet Union or something. But one thing that I think is interesting maybe to talk about for a second, you can go now, I'm kidding, is
I was fearing this.
Is our relationship with the media. Partially because there's a number of media folks here, but also it's a question that often comes up. And one thing that I found very interesting is, I think a lot of our work at the beginning, but still now, has been media criticism. As far as looking at the media, as Jane was saying, the crazy stuff that happened in the 1990s against Bill Clinton when the media was against him and we had no way of fighting back. Now we look at stories when they're wrong. We can go after the newspaper and say, no, this was wrong. Here's the fact you said. Here's evidence online that you were wrong, rather than just writing a letter to the newspaper. Who's going to care? What is interesting is we've also developed a sort of a symbiotic relationship as well with the media, in that there's a number of reporters I know with television reporters, major newspapers, magazines, who know me and trust me, and when they write stories online, they will often send me the link and say, hey, could you link to this? Could you write about it? I will do the same with them. They will sometimes give me news tips, things that maybe weren't a big enough story for them to be able to write about, but they know it's an issue, like on gay issues, for example, that I'm interested in, and they will sometimes tell me off the record, hey, you need to know what happened at the White House today. And vice versa. I will give tips to the media, sometimes because it's better for me as an activist to have a story pop up in the New York Times or ABC News than on my blog. My blog can explode a story, but sometimes the New York Times can explode it even more. So we've developed an interesting relationship where some journalists still hate us, and some of them really like us because we've learned how to work together.
Yeah.
Because of our close relationship with interest groups, politicians, even when we're fighting them, sometimes they'll tell us things they won't tell a journalist, and we think it should get out. But if we write about it, it'll be obvious where it came from. So we're just as good at passing information on.
Yeah. And the media looks to us for stories, which is interesting too. Now, a lot of the reporters will read the top blogs, looking for just little bits of information, and we'll get. I'm still kind of surprised. I'll sometimes write something and get a call from, God, who did I get? Like the New York Post or the New York Daily News. And I saw this on your blog the other day, and I wanted to know more. And I was like, oh, okay. Even today, it still surprises me a little.
But they'll also know, like, we're good gateways to who's following this really closely all the time. And since journalists are lazy, if you can just sort of be
not all of us,
not every present company excluded.
I mean, myself, I started out as a journalist, so I'll make that qualifier because I'm lazy and I want one-stop shopping. If somebody has a good sort of map of the blogosphere in their heads, and they are going to know where to point somebody when something comes in, journalists will show up and say, "Oh, go see Marty Lederman, go see Tyler Durden at Zero Hedge."
And obviously, all the arrows go both ways now when you have developed this new infrastructure. I think we're pretty good with that, and we'll start with questions. So you say one thing when we talk about how these blogs are organized in the U.S. and that they set up political action committees and so on. I want to say right away that we have a network, at least in Sweden, for progressive blogs, not only social democratic blogs, but progressive blogs in general. And Johan has a new report with a lot of information about it, and you will be able to pick that up on your way out. There's loads of copies out there, so please pick one of those up before you leave if you can't stand the heat right now. But now the fun part comes, because now you can ask all your questions as well. And we have a microphone, and just raise your hand. And there are 2 rules when you ask a question in Almedalen. Introduce yourself really quickly with your name, and then a short question. That is not a Soviet Union 4-hour speech. Right. Yeah, we have one there. Mika in the back.
Yeah, my name is Mika, and I have actually 2 questions. And the one is...
Oh, okay.
Oh, stand up. Okay.
Sorry. I have 2 questions. The first one is: at what point you become a journalist? I mean, you are a part of the media actually now. I can't see any difference. Of course, it's a competition with other media, but what do you think about this? And the second is more personal one. I'm following the process of Employee Free Act.
Employee Free Choice Act, yes.
Yeah.
That's a very good example of what we do. Go ahead.
And I would like to hear, are you active in that, and how is it working? Yeah. Because I'm a trade unionist.
Oh, yes?
Yeah. Because
I can tell you up to the minute information on that.
Why don't I take the media question? Why don't you take the
start like
question?
That. Okay. That's a good start. And raise your hand, I'll put your names down if you have a question.
Okay, I'm not going to forget what he said about the media. Are we media? Sometimes. As Jane was saying, both of us have some background in journalism. I was a stringer, meaning writing occasional articles for The Economist for a year. which I think that makes me a real journalist. But what we do on our blogs is a mix. A lot of it is activism. Some of it is activist journalism. Some of it is just journalism. All of us have broken some original stories that have then turned into larger stories. Even examples like, again, this gay rights thing I did the last few weeks. I took an issue of something Obama did that I didn't agree with, to put it lightly, and looked at some of the details and basically very quickly, but he filed
I think that you should start and say that there are two laws in the United States: Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and
All right, I'll
Defense of
explain
Marriage
what the
Act,
thing is
that are very anti-gay, and Obama promised to change them.
Basically, yeah, there's a law against gay marriage that Obama promised to get rid of, and he even said it was abhorrent, which is a word meaning like horrible, that he was going to help get rid of it.
At the same time, he was having anti-gay ministers performing at his, and John was giving them a very rough time for this. We
did a number of, Obama is super pro-gay, but a number of actions that kind of were going anti-gay. Then 2 weeks ago, there was a court case. Some gay people sued about this anti-gay marriage law, and Obama had his Department of Justice respond in court and defend the law, and they defended it with a 50-page brief, a 50-page document, talking about all sorts of things, including comparing gay marriage to incest and pedophilia. Now, yes,
this was a Supreme Court brief. Instead of getting rid of the law,
they defended it and then made really hideous examples of why they defended it. What we were able to do was we got a copy of the government brief that morning on my blog and started. I'm a lawyer, and Joe, who writes with me, is a lawyer too, and started going through the document and pulling paragraphs that were just the worst paragraphs, but I mean 25 or 30 paragraphs. It wasn't just one thing, and you say, well, it's one thing. And started posting these on the blog, and as we'd get more, we'd post more and more, and the thing it exploded in the gay community, but it also exploded in the progressive community in general, and it took a few days, but the media then started to cover it. We got a New York Times editorial, CNN. Finally, Obama had to have a White House event, like I said, with gay people to try to show that he likes us.
The long and short of it is that the administration, the way they try and control these things, is to get gay leaders and neutralize the story by appealing to them. Yep. And so they had their livelihoods threatened or their contracts, their positions, if they didn't come out and support the administration. So they did. And then the problem still persisted, so they invited them to there was a big benefit that they were fundraiser that they were, and John disrupted that, and then they invited them to the White House. But all of this was in response to John's efforts.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, to answer your question real quick on the journalism thing, what is interesting is a lot of the work we did was going and getting this document that people didn't have. Then, as lawyers going through the document, because a 50-page legal document, forget it. Non-lawyers, it would be very difficult to read because the language is unique. I assume here too. Analyzing it for people, presenting it in a way they can understand, and then as the story built over a week or two, listening to things the administration would then say in response, Obama's people, and then, as Jane had said earlier, taking that and then looking and saying, well, wait a minute, what did they say before? Has the language changed? Are they lying? Does it contradict? They claimed they had to do this horrible thing in court because the law required it. So I found two top lawyers who said bullshit, including one lawyer who was a top aide to Bill Clinton in the White House on gay issues. And he said, that's absolutely ridiculous. They did not have to do that. Now, I would call that activism, but I would also call it journalism because you're going and finding information, new information that is interesting news and makes a difference. So it's activism too.
Yeah, it's blurred. The lines are blurred.
It is very blurry.
Yeah.
And we are partisans. I mean, we admit this discussion came up during the Huffington Post seminar earlier in the week. But aren't you Democrats? Aren't you partisans? We freely admit we're partisans. We work to help progressive causes that we believe in. We just admit that. I mean, but then again, most countries, the media is partisan as well, even though they don't admit it. Most newspapers are...
Not in Italy.
Yeah, not in Italy, please. No, but I mean, France, Italy, Greece, the newspapers are tied to the party. I mean, everyone's partisan, but we admit it.
I'm sorry, I have...
She's got her board again.
Oh, okay.
This is, I think, in diagrams.
Right, the second was about this piece of legislation, yeah. that you wanted to talk about.
Oh, we can just go to
trade
the
union.
trade union employee free choice. We just got a 60th senator. The administration has committed to, has said that they will support the Employee Free Choice Act, which has several provisions. They haven't said they will support individual provisions. And there's a particular senator who's being a bit difficult. So we'll see in the next couple of weeks if it happens. It's going to happen probably in September or October. And whether it will, I don't know if either card check or binding arbitration are big issues here, but those are the two things that are at stake, and both of them will be much more watered down than we like, but we hope something will pass.
And if you want to hear more, Mika, you come after the speech tonight, roughly 7:30, 7:45 maybe, to O'Leary's, and we will have the bloggers there, and we will all meet and have a drink and continue the discussion.
The only thing I will say is that nobody would have cared about this issue had the blogs not been there, because Americans don't care about labor issues. And the fact that we were there and we worked very closely with them, we were able to exploit it, and now it's a huge issue that people in Sweden know about.
Yeah, good. And we have another question.
My name is Ulrik Rudebeck. I have two questions. One is, under what conditions is what you've done in the campaign, whatever that is, repeatable in other situations? Could it be repeated in any way in Sweden or other places?
I think much easier here, because you're dealing
but
with...
under what conditions? What are the principal situations that needs to be there?
And go ahead with your second question.
And the second question, if you look at this media landscape, your word I presume, what would you see in the future, like in 5 years? Where is the trends going?
These are questions.
Two interesting questions. Who do
I
you
don't do future
you
questions.
it?
I told you
Yeah,
that.
I know.
Yeah, that's...
We have a division of labor. You start and you fill in. We don't have to. You will start. Interacting
okay.
anyway. So.
Well, I'll do my little diagram, because it sort of does. I'm sorry, I can't help it.
You're the Tim
So
Russell
you're
of
saying, where is
bloggers.
it going? Well, there are a couple things happening right now, and one of them is that dollar to a dime thing, right?
And
that
you will get
everybody
that, yeah.
is suffering under, that everybody is for revenues online.
What did you mean? Did you mean you make $1 offline, but you make 10 cents online as a newspaper?
Same number of eyeballs, yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
when they're losing their offline readership and that readership is transferring online, they're losing 90% of the revenue.
Right.
So the New York Times model of journalism, number one, I'll say one thing, that the whole model that U.S. journalism functions under, there are two sides to every story, and we're objective journalism, we don't take a position. That was something that was developed in the 1940s on a regional newspaper level in order to not offend anybody of either party. It's not sort of naturally what journalism is. 99% of all journalism that's ever been done in human history, the people who are writing it say, I have a particular bias. So just the fact that we have a political bias or an issue bias doesn't mean that you're not a journalist anymore. It just means that you're following a particular tradition. But with this dollar to a dime revenue situation, the New York Times covering something used to be, their model was, white guy in New York flies to Tehran,
exactly. Yeah.
decides what the story is, and sends it back to the U.S. And we saw this at work in Iraq, because the United States didn't care what Iraqis thought. We cared what embedded reporters told us Iraqis thought, which, as we found out, was very different. It's a very expensive model. It's got a big building here in the background, lots of overhead, and it needs the dollar to pay for it. The dime won't pay for it. So, what will the dime pay for? The dime will pay for what we do. As pipes get fatter, right, and Sweden, I know, had very early broadband adoption, it becomes more possible to get things directly from primary sources, like John was talking about, legal briefs. There used to be one reporter would read it and tell everybody what it said, and then that would be the acceptable.
And I got the brief from one of our readers.
Yeah.
A lot of our tips, which is great, the readers give us, or we can even ask them in the aggregate and say, hey, can you guys try to find us stuff? And they do.
Even if stuff isn't online, original video that people, during the Gaza crisis, when they allowed no journalists in, we had people walking out in their backyards with flip video cameras and taking pictures of cluster bombs and putting them on YouTube and sending them to us. So we knew what was going on more than the journalists who were standing at the gates trying to get in did. So what one person, you got a guy in his pajamas, right, sitting behind his desk, covering something, dealing with Twitter feeds, can cover something more immediately and much cheaper than this journalist going to Tehran and coming back. So the whole notion of what journalism is changing. And I've been telling this in panels to journalists for years, and they hate it when you say this. They say, we are classically trained, and we bring something to this that you can't possibly replicate, and you didn't cover the crime beat at the Baltimore courthouse for years, so clearly you don't know what you're doing. And it's like, you know, good luck with that one, because this is where it's going whether anybody wants it or not. The financial model, even if that comes back, somebody sitting at their desk can listen to what Iranians are saying in the moment about what's happening in their country better than this guy who's never been here before can dictate what the American, you know, view will be on a situation. So in 5 years, I think we're going to see less of him and more of him.
What was the second part of the question?
That was the landscape, and then it is how can it be repeated in Sweden? And that is very difficult, I know. But if
no, you know what? I'll give Bjorn. I'm going to call on you in the back, or at least point you out. Bjorn in the back, whose name, of course, isn't pronounced Bjorn, I'm sure, because that's the way we say it in the States. But you know what I mean. He did something in the last year or so? I don't know, Johan was telling me about this, where he found a copy of a book that I guess your prime minister had written, who didn't apparently want the book to be out there. And Bjorn was able to get a copy of the book, scan it in on a computer, and put it on the web. So everyone had a copy of the Prime Minister's book. And it was apparently rather embarrassing for the Prime Minister. That's the kind of thing the blogs do in the States. I mean, that's in a way that's very similar to what I did with the legal brief. Getting something that other people may not have access to and putting it up in a way, publishing it in a way that is accessible for everyone. And I would also say at the same time, it's not just that. It's not just finding things that people can't find, but it's having a journalistic sense, a feeling, it's a skill, I think, it is a skill, that you know that this thing is interesting. You know, you could publish anything and it's not necessarily interesting, but he knew that this book was going to cause a problem for the Prime Minister. He knew that people would find this interesting, and he went and got it. And that's a lot of what we do. It's trying to find interesting things to write about, trying to find things that advance our agenda, getting to your sort of question, but also having some skill that journalists have, and I'd almost have you guys explain what that is, but you've got a sixth sense about what is news. What do people find interesting? And a good journalist does.
The thing that gives this guy power is that he knows everything about a particular subject. If you have a subject that you care about, an issue that you care about, and you can burrow into it, and you can become the expert on it, you can shape what happens with that subject because people will look to you for information. When something happens in Tehran and this guy knows where every single thing is on the web and he, you know, speaks the language or whatever, that guy can control what the subject is. So if you can establish yourself as the expert, as the repository, know where the information is, so that when news breaks, you know where it is. Somebody else starting from scratch is going to have to start putting things together. They'll go to you, and
Jane,
that's
Jane, one normal criticism of the blogs is that in the first example, at least you have in theory a very strict process of editing, and you really do fact checks. And the New York Times try to establish themselves as really the best people around in terms of checking the story, and we were wrong about this and that last day and so on. And maybe that's a normal criticism. You get to the blogosphere, who is really checking the guy who is putting out something on the web? Who is he or she accountable to? The 100,000 people that show up a day and come in our comments section and tell us when things are wrong.
You should see the emails I get about typographical errors. I got one this morning from a reader. I'm not trying to be mean. I love you guys. I read you every day. But here's 2 examples of things you misspelled today on the blog, and it really hurts your credibility. And I'm like, ugh. Yeah. And they don't just do that. I mean, they will find things we've written and say, no, you got that story wrong. Here's other information to show what really is going on. It's not foolproof, of course. It's almost a little bit of the Wikipedia example when Wikipedia works at its best. Meaning that you've got a collective of people who are always being a little bitchy and very attentive. But the other thing is, I think for the top blogs, at least on the left, I think we got where we are by having a series of stories we worked on that became very big and ended up being true. So that, just going to keep going back to the same examples, but this gay thing I worked on, and I always get emails like this. People said, oh my God, you wrote about this on Friday. Nobody in the media even covered it until Tuesday, and now we've got a New York Times editorial that is telling us exactly the same thing about the law that you were saying on Friday. That created more credibility for me. And every time we work on something that people go, I haven't heard about that, or that's a different interpretation, and in the end people find out that it's true, or credible at least, it gives us, it just, you collect a little more credibility and a little more belief. So that, I mean, you have to earn, you have to earn your credibility, at least in the States. One person can maybe cause a firestorm, yes, by being an idiot and lying, yes. But it won't, I don't think it'll happen twice with the same person, because people feel burned if they believed him and they told all their friends and then found out it wasn't true. You know, one crazy blogger.
Good. We have another question. Hold on for 1 second, you get the mic. Yeah.
Kenneth Abrahamson, I used to be a scholar, I'm now a bureaucrat. I just wonder, in this kind of instant coffee democracy, if you focus too much on issues that are visible, have immediate impact, and how do you deal with broader issues that you have to deal with in open society, more long-term, complex issues?
Like what?
Pardon?
Like what?
Well, how do you reform your welfare system?
I think he means hitting on issues that are popular.
Yeah,
rather than
really
important.
digging yourself down for having two guys in the office in the journalistic sense in a big.
I mean, you get focus on things where you get
They
attention.
can't afford to do that anymore. There's one labor journalist in the country. His name's Steve Greenhouse, and he writes for the New York Times, and he writes about other stuff too.
Yes.
So they can't afford to do that anymore. So what happens is that you've got people who actually care about the issues. They can work for labor unions, they can work for interest groups, they can work for think tanks, and they're actually aggregating the information. And a lot of what's happening is that they're controlling the flow of the story by putting information out to us, to journalists, to everything else. So the whole model is changing. But the diagram I drew earlier about this sort of, small, these, sort of mini blogospheres going around, those people, Glenn Greenwald knows more about internet privacy and, domestic spying than anyone in the country. Eric Lichtblau, I like Eric. Eric Lichtblau worked for the New York Times, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for breaking the story about how the government was doing this wireless wiretapping. I talked with Eric at one point, and he acknowledges that the reason that the New York Times held that story for a year, they could have broken it before the 2004 election, but they didn't. The reason they held it for a year was because they said the public is not there yet, and the New York Times will never be a year ahead of where they think the public is, despite the fact that this was very earth-shaking news. Glenn Greenwald is a First Amendment lawyer who knows everything about the subject. He is encyclopedic. He has written books about it at any given day. And there is no day that Glenn Greenwald will ever hesitate to say anything because he thinks that his readers aren't there or anything like that. So he has a level of trust, whereas people look at the New York Times and they go, are you telling me because you believe this is true or because you think that this is what your readers think?
But just one question, because I think we can agree that it was great maybe 10, 20 years ago when, for example, in Sweden we had a journalist like Björn Elmbrandt on the radio who just wandered around and worked long-term on issues for 2 weeks, and then he published a little broadcast and he could really dig himself down into a subject. Now he's not at the radio anymore because you're right that most media houses can't afford it anymore. But on the other hand, are the bloggers really doing this instead, the long term? Or are they just trying to clear up when something is breaking?
Well, again, there are two different things. John and I work in that big circle of big tropic blogs, and we're like a big newspaper. We don't just focus on one thing. Our readers show up and they want to know where to go. So we point them to Glenn Greenwald or other people because they're the experts and we follow what's going on over there. But those people are deeply dug in. Tyler Durden, I don't know if anybody saw, Fight Club. He calls himself Tyler Durden, but he's a trader on Wall Street. And he knows about what's going on with the financial institutions like nobody's business. And he recently moved his blog offshore to be able to get away from domestic internet spying because he's getting all these tips that should be going to the SEC, but the SEC isn't acting on. And Matt Taibbi... the Securities and Exchange Commission. Matt Taibbi, I don't know if anybody knows him, but he's a famous American journalist, recently used Tyler's information, went to him, and wrote a big expose of Goldman Sachs that appeared in Rolling Stone last week. But that all came because Tyler is not only, professionally predisposed to understand what's going on, but also knows the insiders, is getting the tips in a way that, with a thoroughness that, no journalist covers. So Mother Jones recently did a story, how did 5,000, financial journalists get the last 5 years wrong? We weren't hearing about what was going on. Oh, the economy is crashing. Who knew? So, there's definitely a problem up there that is actually, I think, being addressed down here.
Yeah, let me make a quick point, which is, and I'm going to summarize what I think your question is, and I'll probably be wrong, but it's an interesting point, even if I am wrong, which is, to some degree, it's almost like asking, are you just sort of gossip politics? Whatever the hot thing is today, you write about, but how does that really help us long-term thinking about big issues about healthcare or whatever? Again, whether or not that's your question, I think it's an interesting question. As Jane was explaining earlier, in the States, and I do not see this in France, and I don't really see it in Greece or other places either, very early on in political blogs, we became very specialized. I wanted to write about U.S. politics with a strong focus on the religious right and a strong focus on gay politics, but also U.S. across the board. We've got another blogger friend, Duncan, who I mentioned earlier, one of the top blogs, PhD in economics. Duncan writes a lot about economics, but a lot about everything else too, but especially economics. There are feminist blogs. There are, green blogs. You've got people, Glenn, who does a lot of legal analysis, who she keeps mentioning, who's especially interested in privacy. My first point is, you tend not to have a problem where issues in general are being ignored because there's a specialty on almost every issue. So at least it's not like nobody writes about the environment. No, that happens at least. Now, do you have an issue where maybe the environmental issues that are being talked about are always the hot issue of the day, no pun intended, rather than some long-term thinking about the environment? On my blog, certainly, yes, we are writing about the issues of today. I try to, and I even tell the guys who write with me, we try to link what we're writing to something larger. So don't just, because you can go and read the New York Times if you want to know that, today the White House did something. I don't know. I don't care. Then go to the New York Times. But I want you to say, today the White House did something, and why does it matter? Well, as a political person, that's interesting because I've been following this White House for 6 months, but 2 years, and there's been a pattern of behavior of Obama that he tends to, say he's going to be with you, but then in the end he goes to the middle. I don't know what, but you try to tie the stories into some larger theme, some larger point. Now, it still means that on my blog, we do not necessarily have long essays about the future of gay rights and I don't know what. No, we don't do that. But that's not who we try to be. And I would argue, and Jane may or may not agree with me on this, I don't know, I find the mainstream media very useful. Much of what I write is based on what a mainstream journalist does. But I will either find something at the bottom of his story that he put in there, but it was at the bottom, and say, whoa, this is way more important than you think. Or as I said, I'll find a story and say, this is interesting when you think back to 3 other stories and try to create a larger theme. So I find I do not want to be a replacement for the mainstream media because I would lose probably 3/4 of my content because I'm not going to be able to find information about the environment, about Iran and everything. So I don't. I'm just saying, to some degree, we don't try to replace long-term thinking. That's what think tanks are for, I would argue.
Well, I'll just say that one thing to remember: people will put a lot of effort into a blog story, and they get very upset because nobody cares. People want to talk about what people want to talk about. You can't change that. The way the right handed our asses to us in the 80s was that they learned that they could carry their message into any story. So they would send people out. The media wants to talk about Britney Spears that day, great. They'll send somebody out to give the right view on Britney Spears, and they'll get their message out there. And the left kept saying, oh, well, we're wonks and we want to talk about things in a serious way. And we got clobbered. So we have learned to bring our message to the story that people want to talk about. And, your audience, if you have to find a way to make whatever you want to say to them interesting. And you can't dictate what people care about. It's impossible. So the best thing you can do is ride the wave, understand what people want to talk about, what your readers care about, and then find a way to shape your message within that.
Right. In other words, we are still writing about things that fit into our personal agenda. Every story I write, unless it's a horrible news day and I'm desperate, usually there's some reason I chose that story, not just because I think it's interesting, not just because I think it tells a larger story, but also because it tells a larger story that I think supports whatever agenda I'm pushing, whether it is trying to pressure Obama, whether it's supporting gay rights, whether it's helping Jane push some legislation that she's doing. But there's usually always some specific intent. We're not just going to write about Michael Jackson all day because that's going to get hits. We'll write about it once.
Yeah.
And I link to a story and I don't comment on it because I don't care. But our readers do. So
yeah, we have. I think it was a good answer, right? Yeah, and we have another question in the back, and that will be. I think if anyone has a short question, raise your hand. Otherwise, you can start. Present yourself.
Hi, I'm Anna Sörner. I just had a seminar with Huffington Post earlier this week, and I just would like to hear, what do you think is the difference for you having your own blogs instead of going into a greater gateway? Like Huffington Post is, in my opinion, a kind of mixture between a newspaper and a blog paper. Well, I don't know if you agree with that.
Oh no, I mean it's very much. I think where the relationship is interesting. I've known Ariana since the day the Huffington Post went up. She used to come to little blogger parties in the Simi Valley in California that she no longer does with bloggers. 25 bloggers. But I also write for the Huffington Post. So when I want to hit people politically, like I put their name in a headline and I put it over at the Huffington Post and I call them up and say, would you put this high on the page? So, I use it for a very specific purpose. But we're very interdependent. We know all those people. We link back and forth. It's a world, and everybody sort of functions interdependently in it. And what I was talking about earlier about how the blogs sort of developed this, this other consensus worldview that the Obama campaign actually grew out of. We're seeing a whole class of journalists, but people who are real journalists, young people like Sam Stein, Nico Pitney, come up who are reflecting that worldview, working at the Huffington Post. So yes, they're working at a newspaper, but they're accustomed to working at the speed that blogs do. Like we respond very quickly to news that comes through, and the New York Times hasn't quite figured out how to do that yet. So they're speaking to a particular sensibility, and they're operating at a specific pace. But it's still a large community, really.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. They're different, but I don't really see a positive or negative other than Huffington Post is able to have so many different parts of their site that they're able to get a lot more traffic, which I love that. But it doesn't really, we don't find that it changes the way they write, which is interesting. Although actually, I don't really read their blogs, I read their news. But their news, in some ways, is similar to our blog writing.
Yeah, they've really broken down a lot of that objective journalist stuff and become, more what I think we'll be seeing in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
And what I think we will see in Sweden, or I hope from the left at least, is that we will continue to study how the progressive blogosphere developed, because we mentioned some key parts of your, we can call it a framework now. You put it up there with the blogs, with the Huffington Post. You also have Media Matters, for example, so that goes into the media. You have the think tanks. Some of them were mentioned. CAP, Center for American Progress, being the biggest on to the left of center right now. And I think that is a discussion that we should continue on the left. Is there a last question? Are we really hot? And you all know that you can meet these people again later?
Well, and we can hang out a few minutes too.
Yeah. I just want to say that I just saw the president of the Swedish trade union, LO, standing here listening a little bit, so we're probably going to grab her as well and ask for some money to continue this discussion.
And we'll take some too.
And see if we can continue this, I think, really interesting discussion and this friendship that we are developing on the left, from the center left, with bloggers in the US. And Johan, we're going to continue. You have Johan's report right when you walk out. If you haven't had a newspaper from this week, you haven't been on this island, I think. But I've been handing them out here as well. And from Aktuellt i Politiken and from Netroot and Johan from from the parliamentary group of the Social Democrats. I think we are happy now, Johan. We were so excited about arranging this, and we are so thankful for you guys showing up, and extremely thankful for our guests all the way from the US of A. And meet them again if you want to. A quick beer at O'Leary's after the speech, roughly 7:30, and hang out a little bit more if you want. And thanks for standing in the heat with us. It was great.